Hi, welcome to Camera Collection. Today I'm taking a look at a Bolex. This Bolex is a 16 millimeter motion picture camera. So you might find all different kinds of Bolexes out there. I've seen lots of regular 8 and perhaps there's some Super 8. This is 16 millimeter. There were even some modified Super 16 Bolexes floating around. I don't know if Bolex made those or not. My story with the Bolex goes back to film school. That's usually the place where most folks are introduced to Bolexes. I started off making films in college using Super 8. It's an affordable medium, at least at the time, but still gave you the discipline of shooting on film. So my second filmmaking class, they were still shooting a little bit of Super 8, and you had the option to shoot some 16 millimeter. And of course, you know, having come from Super 8, I jumped at the chance to shoot on some 16 millimeter using the Bolex. The Bolex is a fan favorite, and you know, we have, I've used all kinds of different 16 millimeter and 35 millimeter cameras. But there's something really simple about the Bolex. It was made to be a home movie camera, and something about that lends itself to being able to be, you know, I can quickly pick this up and go out and film a roll with my kids. I could take it on vacation. I could make, you know, a really cool looking music video using the aesthetics of film. And so the Bolex is that gateway to 16 millimeter filmmaking that, you know, if you jump into getting an Arri or something like that, there's a lot more different parts, might be more expensive to fix, but I've seen all different kinds of Bolexes out there in the world in all different conditions. So they made these for a number of years. The Bolex comes out of Switzerland, and this particular one here, the Reflex model, is a spring wound camera. So what that means is that there are no electrical motors in here. It's all a spring, like a wind up toy. And so when I use that, it expels that energy and runs the motor inside the camera and moves the film through it and exposes the film. That's really cool. And it doesn't require any external batteries. That's another really great thing about this. I can just grab this and go and not have to worry about, you know, did I charge up all the batteries and carrying those around. Later on when I was in film school, we're using like an Arri S or something, and we had these battery belts that, you know, we called them Chewbacca belts because they essentially look like Chewbacca's bandolier. And, you know, that's a lot of extra weight. Plus, once they die, that's it. You're done. You gotta wait for them to charge for, it seemed like hours and hours and, you know, days. This one I have fitted with the, you know, pretty standard, a 16 millimeter, a 25 millimeter, and a 75 millimeter lens. So that gives me everything from a wide angle to a telephoto. It has this lens turret, which is cool in that I can rotate to use a different lens. So only one lens is photographing at a time. So I'm using that, and I could quickly switch, you know, but most likely you're gonna stop filming, switch the lens, change the focus, make sure your f-stop is set, and then begin filming again. I think in film school I did actually probably, you know, film continuously from one lens to another as a aesthetic choice. I could outfit a Bolex with a zoom. There are some zooms out there for sure. If that's your, you know, interest, they, you know, tend to be more expensive than some of the prime lenses, though I have seen the prime lenses go for quite a mint. The Bolex uses a C-mount lens, which means it screws in to the mount quite simply, and that's it. There were some variations on that depending on if you have a reflex or a non-reflex camera, so be careful when buying lenses. They may not fit accordingly, and they could damage your camera. So a lot of early video systems actually use this same C-mount, so you might find some really inexpensive lenses for a Bolex as well that might say video lens, and that's what they're talking about. A lot of different filmmakers and types of filmmakers have used Bolexes over the years. Because I can shoot in fast motion, slow motion, and at regular 24 frames per second with this camera. It's been adopted by a lot of different folks. It also has the capability of shooting one frame at a time. So when I was in film school, we had to do an animation project for one of our films, and the Bolex is basically the main camera that we used. To adapt an Arri to shoot 1 frame at a time was way more cumbersome. I can actually push this trigger forward to take 1 frame at a time. It's got a lot of other cool things here, like that motor itself can actually be controlled. I can shoot really long exposures, much like a photographer uses the bulb setting on their camera. When I'm shooting in regular motion though, that switch has nothing to do with it. Here I'm rolling. That's what the camera sounds like when I'm rolling at about 24 frames per second without any film in there. So as you might guess, this camera really isn't made for filming sync sound with. It's really what we call a wild camera or wild motor camera. And so that means if I tried to record some sound with it, I would hear a lot of camera noise. Also, because of that spring wound motor, it runs at about 24 frames per second. There's no guarantee that it's going to be precisely at 24 frames per second, which would cause your audio to drift in and out. We wouldn't want that to happen. So to get a reflex system to work in this old camera, they engineered something different than Arri and some of the SLRs that you might be familiar with, which use a mirror. And so the way that Bolex tackled that, and maybe there's some still cameras out there too that do it this way, is by using a prism inside the viewing system. So part of that light goes through the lens and into that prism, and part of the light is diverted up to the eyepiece so that you can see what you're framing up. So we get to see exactly what we're looking through the lens, which is fantastic. But as you might have guessed, the prism actually causes you to lose some light, right? Because part of it is diverted up to the eyepiece. It amounts to about 2/3 of a stop. So if you compensate using your light meter, resetting the ISO is usually how I go about it. So that I don't have to subtract 2/3 of a stop. I just take care of it in the metering process. And now, my 500 speed film is essentially 320. So much like a wind-up toy, a certain amount of energy is stored up when I wind this camera. And so what that means is that eventually it will stop, right? And I'll have to wind it up again. So typically, a Bolex camera in good condition will have about 30 seconds of filming time. Now you think, oh wow, 30 seconds, that's not long enough. I need more. But if you think about it, you're not doing dialogue with this camera. You're not filming long drawn out sequences, though of course you want to as soon as you can't, right? So what that means is I can only film for about 30 seconds. But to give you some context to that, right, a 100-foot spool, which is the size of the film that is going to be run through this camera, a 100-foot spool only has about 2 minutes and 45 seconds worth of runtime as it is. So that means you'll have to wind the camera 5 or 6 times if you wanted to do 30-second shots, and that would be your whole roll of film. 30 seconds is a really long time. Get out your stopwatch and take a look at that. That's what I used to do in class when we were demoing this, and everybody would groan when there's only 30 seconds. And I said, okay, let's start. Right, I'm not gonna do it now for the video, but one thing that always happens to me is that I'll film this shot, and what will happen is I'll forget to wind after that, in which case I've still expelled that energy, so now I only have 20 seconds, and then I film another shot, and now I only have 15 seconds, and now I want to do that long take where somebody does something, and I only have 15 seconds left. So remember to always wind after you've filmed for a little bit. So I'm going to take this out and give this a wind. So it's sort of counterclockwise. I'm adding energy back into this motor. There we go. It's going to stop. Don't force it any further than that. And I'm going to reset this winder right there. I remember when I was in film school and somebody... I can't remember what they were doing, but I think it was something like they left the winder arm in place and they began filming and they kept hitting themselves with it. And that was a funny story. All right, so I want to make sure and put that back into its resting spot, and then it'll move freely. I probably shouldn't film in slow motion without film being in there because I've got metal parts beating against each other without a piece of soft film to run through it. But I just want to give you a quick sense of what that sounds like. So that energy that I talked about with the wind, I only have about 30 seconds when filming at 24 frames per second. If I'm filming at 64 frames per second, right, using some math and some ratios, I probably have about not even half that time, right? At 48 frames per second, I would have about 15 seconds of filming. So I'm using the same amount of film that I would use at 24 or 30 seconds when I'm filming at 48 frames per second. 64 would be just that little bit extra, right? And so 64 frames per second will give you that really cool slow motion. Many of you that are shooting video, you might shoot 60p to get that slow-mo effect on your DSLR. And this would be close to that, right? But in glorious film. So yeah, you could shoot color film, black and white film. Any 16mm film will work in a Bolex as long as it has single perforations. It'll be fine. Double perf would also work in this camera, but they don't make that anymore. I can use filters with this camera. I have some filters for it. There's a little filter slot right behind the lens here. I put a piece of Kodak Raton filter in that little holder and then put it behind the lens. But don't forget that you've got it loaded up in there. So if I have some filters for color film and then I'm shooting black and white, that might give me a different image. Also, remember to compensate your f-stop when you're using filters, when you're using slow motion. You have to make sure and do all the calculating of what your exposure will be. How do I use the Bolex these days? I'm not shooting a lot of film these days, as you know, I probably wouldn't film one of these videos on film. It would be rather expensive. Typically a roll of film brand new from Kodak I think is around $40. To get that processed would probably be another $30 to $40 depending on which lab you send it to. And I know there's some folks out there that are probably doing some home processing of 16mm black and white, maybe 16mm color for that matter. So getting the film transferred after you've got it processed is probably one of the more expensive aspects of making a film and on 16mm. And so, you know, depending on if the lab offers that service or if you need to take it to a post-production company to get it transferred or scanned. There's not very many DIY solutions. I have seen students and filmmakers, you know, load up the film in the projector and film it off the wall using their 4K cameras. But that has a certain aesthetic to it. It's not exactly pretty. It might be a little bit too gritty. But that's up to you to decide, right? You're the artist. So how do I use the Bolex? I haven't shot anything with this camera in probably a couple of years. It's part of the collection. And I really enjoy shooting with a Bolex camera, especially doing sort of home movies, maybe take it with. One time I took one of these with me to Berlin and carried it around, you know, for several weeks. I even brought it to the Love Parade, which is a giant techno party in the park, and filmed some other things with it as well. It's not a light camera to carry around. This is probably 20 years ago. My friend who helped me out with the transfer, that's really where you gotta have friends, you know, joked with me that it was a pretty expensive home movie because I probably shot 13 rolls of film that summer. A lot of it was just, you know, home movie stuff, right? I didn't have a direction to film a particular narrative, so I was just collecting images, much like a photographer might wander around and photograph a new city. I was doing that with the Bolex.